This is going to be exciting. Give you a minute or two. Well, ladies and gentlemen, so how many out there know what a management accountability framework is? Okay. How many have participated in the process of responding to these? Excellent, excellent. So you should be well primed. Shall I ask how many read the evaluation and/or Evert Lindquist's paper that we sent out? Yeah, not so many. Okay, a couple. That's good though. That's good. But you'll be ready. These are going to be great presentations. They're going to keep them brief so that there will be time for questions and discussion and dialogue and hopefully insight and inspiration. And we have created the safe space that we said was the legacy of Peter Green. So we encourage you to use that safe space to ask the questions as you will. I have to my right, initially, it will be Vicki Westerheide and Sandy Moore and Janice Rime. And Vicki is, of course, the Assistant Director of Evaluation at Treasury Board Secretariat. Ben Kopp is going to be with us, who is with the MAFT, who is the Director of the MAFT Directorate. He had a family emergency, he could not be with us. So we'll do our best to fill the gap there. But then Sandy and Janice are partners with Goss Gilroy Associates, who were the contracted evaluation team. And so Vicki and Sandy, I understand, and Janice will be around for comments, will be able to speak to the evaluation, which will be the first presentation, and that'll be followed by Dr. Evert Lindquist, who will talk about what he contributed to the, again, How Ottawa Spends, Chapter 11, and a little bit further about the public access and the sharing of information and transparency in government. So without further ado, Vicki.
Thanks very much, Steve, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think just to clarify, since the program came out, we had some changeovers in our unit, and I've gone back to my substantive position as Senior Evaluation Manager, which I was for this evaluation as well. We operate a very small team at TBS, and GGI acts as an extension of our team, and we've enjoyed working with them on a number of projects, including the MAF evaluation. The annual assessment, or rather MAF, is an annual assessment of management capabilities. For those who aren't completely familiar with it, it has 7 areas of management, each with its own set of methodological questions, and information is provided by departments through a portal. One of the things that I did just prior to this gathering was to go back over the 2009 evaluation report of the MAF, and it really reminded me of the kinds of changes that that the MAF has gone through, and the world we are operating in has gone through as well. And there's been a lot of progress that's been made since then. One of the reasons why this evaluation was undertaken was really by request from the MAF Directorate. Typically, our evaluations land on our plan as a result of a consultation process. Some of them land on the plan as a result of risk analysis or request, and that was the case with the MAF evaluation, which I think is quite commendable, given that programs are not often all that keen to have themselves evaluated. And this was also done in light of the significant changes that have been made to the MAF methodologies. As I was saying, GGI does operate as an extension of our team, and they did a lot of the legwork for the evaluation. So in light of that, I'm just going to turn this over to Sandy now, who is going to take you through the findings and the recommendations of the evaluation.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to wait for my deck to show up there, and then we'll talk all about the evaluation. Well, maybe I'll get started, and then when it pops up, I'll go ahead and advance the slides. So when did we do this evaluation? Like a year ago, right? It's about a year ago. And we carried out 5 lines of evidence to do the evaluation. So we did, there we go. Ta-da. So we did a literature review, and when I say we, I mean Evert. And it was largely a comparative analysis. So looking at other jurisdictions, what they do, what their governments do in terms of assessing capabilities and performance. We looked at documents, and I can assure you, as I use Assure Me, there were lots of documents to look at, departmental level as well as the documents at the policy centers, policies, instruments, that sort of thing, what's on the portal. We did 35 key informant interviews, typo there, including 9 interviews with deputy heads. We interviewed 6 academic and other experts. We spoke with someone at PCO, and we spoke with 19 folks, well, in fact, more than 19 people at departments and agencies. We also did group interviews, but we did 19 interviews with departments and agencies. We also did an online survey of the functional communities. So these are the folks within departments and agencies who are, you're in this room, you're producing the results, you're responding to the questions and responding to the indicators. We invited 273, and we got a response rate of 62. And then we did some case studies. So as Vicki mentioned, there's 7 AOMs. The original idea was to do 2 case studies in each AOM. A couple of the AOMs, we didn't get some take-up, so we ended up doing 12 case studies. But the idea was to do a deep dive within a department or agency to see how first of all, how the policy center comes up with the questions, and then how the departments respond, and that consultation interaction. So the findings. So we looked at 4 main evaluation issues. In the area of relevance, I mean, the headline is that it is relevant, but it really depends on who the user is in terms of how relevant. So there's no question that there's a continuing need. Everyone sort of said, yes, there's a continuing need. Even people that we interviewed who sort of weren't sure if there was a lot of relevance for them, they were hesitant to say, oh yeah, let's just get rid of it. So there's still value. As I mentioned, based on the user. So probably the user type that really values the math is the Treasury Board Secretariat, right? It's very, very relevant to policy centers because a big chunk of the questions is around policy compliance. This is a key mechanism to determine how well departments and agencies are implementing the policies that they come out with. Departments and agencies, less so. Functional community representatives in departments and agencies, they also see some value because it helps them to know where to place their priority for the following year. Some departments and agencies have a very formal process to take math results, turn that into plans, turn that into actions. Other departments and agencies, it's a bit more fluid, shall we say. Deputy heads, however, they, for the most part, were questioning the value of math for them in their day-to-day work. They see it as a health check, Lindquist health check. Perhaps it's confirming things that they already know. Often they're not learning very much new through the math. But as I say, they're hesitant to sort of let it go. PCO, so one of the uses of the math results is it feeds into the Committee of Senior Officials that's run by PCO, which feeds into deputy head PMAs and performance. It's part of the decision-making around PMA, performance-based pay for deputy heads. But we found that its influence is declining, mostly because the other sources of information that influence deputy head performance are getting better. So they don't need the math results quite as much. So in terms of achievement of outcomes, we looked at a number of outcomes. If you look at the evaluation online, you can see them more specifically. But I'm going to talk about 4 outcome areas in particular. So as I mentioned, in terms of the implementation of TBS policies, it definitely increases TBS insight into how well policies are being implemented. So that's the main purpose as far as TBS is concerned. I want to emphasize, though, that organizational context is really important to understanding the performance, and this is probably one of the main criticisms that we heard about the math analysis as it's currently done. Departments want to explain why they're responding the way they are, why there are perhaps limitations, or why they haven't made as much progress, and they found that in the analysis that context piece was not being properly or fully reflected. And quite frankly, the departments themselves are less interested in policy compliance, right? In terms of transparency, I mean, any public servant with a MyKey has access to the math results. It's all there on the portal. But however, it's not publicly available. So transparency outside Government of Canada is practically non-existent. When we spoke with folks, we did interviews on this, there was some openness to sharing government-wide level results perhaps. And I know Everett's going to talk more about transparency in open government. In terms of the outcome-related deputy head performance, as I say, it's still feeding in. It's still one of the factors they look at, but its influence is waning. In terms of management improvements, certainly when you look at the data, the math results show that there have been improvements in management, for sure. But again, I'm going to repeat myself very briefly, just the deputy heads don't see that it really makes a difference for them. And we also found that often departments are not reallocating resources according to the math results. So if the math result says, oh, you know what, your IMIT, you know, you guys are really, compared to other departments, you're not doing very well, it's pretty rare that the department, that the deputy head will say, oh, well, in that case, let's reallocate our resources and do better under IMIT. They have mandate letters that they have to respond to. They have other priorities. They have other things that come up. And so math results are not tending to drive resource reallocation. In terms of design and delivery, very quickly, so math was actually introduced in 2003, wasn't it? That was a long time ago. And then I think it was 2013-14, there was a new math, what we call Math 2.0 was introduced, which went away from ratings towards this comparison. And generally people were happy with that. There's less burden on departments and agencies on the whole, so that was appreciated. Ironically, there's actually probably a little more burden on policy centers at Treasury Board Secretariat, however. We did find some challenges, so the math portal, there's some functionality challenges, the timing of when the math occurs in the fiscal year, the people had some concerns there, and as I mentioned, not enough consideration of the organizational context. One piece that we tried to get into in the evaluation, but we were limited by time and resources and because it's complex, is actually looking at the validity and the reliability of the math methodology. So are we asking the right questions? Are we asking the right indicators? And, you know, on the whole, we found that it's inconsistent by area of management. Some areas of management are doing really well at this, and other ones not so much. We did find overall that there's sort of a disconnect between the AOM questions and the health of the function, however. So generally, I'd say room for improvement. In terms of efficiency, as I mentioned, there is a reduction in the burden on departments. But there's still a demand for even less process because the questions are becoming increasingly complex. So there's always this balance between performance questions and compliance questions. Performance questions are harder to answer. They're more complex, therefore they require more work. And so as the Secretariat focuses on those performance questions, burden is going to increase. All right, so that's the quick and dirty findings. And you feel free to ask us any questions. We'll be happy to answer. So recommendations. We came out with the following recommendations. So first of all, as we mentioned, there is a real mix in terms of relevance. Who is the math for? And so we weren't super clear on that question. So we're saying you better clarify who the audience of the math is. Also, continue strengthening the validity and reliability of these methodologies. Okay, there's still opportunities to streamline. Improving the math portal. So we did hear lots of complaints from departments and agencies about the functionality of the portal. It's not very user-friendly. And then finally, this idea of weaving in the context, the organizational context in the analysis and in the feedback to the departments and agencies in terms of what they can improve. So I'm going to turn it back to Vicki. Vicki's going to pretend to be Ben right now.
And although I'm going to pretend to be Ben, I can't put words in his mouth, so I'm just going to largely do a skim of the management response and action plan. And directly related to that, one of the key things that that MAFD committed to doing was to consult audiences like PSMAC, which is a committee of deputy heads, to find out more about what they need from the MAF, what kinds of information would better meet their needs, but also to have the policy centers articulate specifically the value of of their methodologies to the individual groups who use the results. In terms of the validity and reliability, the MRAP committed to exercising a stronger challenge function through various fora, so challenging the policy centers more extensively, having an extra meeting of an ADM group to address and discuss the validity and reliability. And I think all of this is really to ensure that that when the information is used, when the math results are used, that they're actually meaningful, that they're actually useful. And then in terms of things like the portal and the timing, MAFD committed to consulting more extensively, doing more stakeholder engagement to try and resolve the IT issues, to try and tighten up the communication around the math cycle. And then finally, as Sandy was mentioning, the issue of context is really critical, and I think was particularly for deputy heads, with it being a reflection of the department as a whole, that math assessment exists within that context of mandate priorities, of unexpected emergencies that come up, and therefore of resource allocation. And so, you know, we sometimes say that context is everything, and certainly within the context of the math assessment, it is a really critical area. So that's, we'll go over now to Evert.
So Dr. Evert Lindquist, of course, is the editor of the IPAC Journal of Canadian Public Administration and a professor at University of Victoria. So we won't take I hope you're writing some questions down for our first presenters, because we'll go right through if that's okay, and then we'll take questions at the end.
All right, thank you. Good, and thank you for those presentations, Vicki, Sandy, and Janice will hear from you later. It's too bad that Ben cannot be here, because only he knows what the MAF Directorate is thinking about right now. Steve, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you from the PPX Executive Committee to the committee for the invitation to come back again. Today what I want to do is really focus on an open government perspective on math, which is really taking the conversation beyond where the evaluation has left off, but in the spirit of open by default and open government, open data, I thought it would be useful to provide a little bit of a perspective on this. It's been noted, it's important to realize that math has been around for 15 years. And I think it's also important, in light of some of the deputies' reviews and input into the last evaluation process, is to understand where math began. Math at one time did not have a whole lot of indicators. It did not have a lot of measures. It began as a result of Jim Judd, then Secretary of the Treasury Board, and the newly appointed Secretary then, feeling that what deputies wanted to do was to engage their executive teams on the things that kept them up in the middle of the night. In other words, they wanted to have a dialogue about the context they were in. In those days, you know, the June 93 restructuring and other cutbacks were working their way, and program review changes were working their way through the system. So there were huge questions about program integrity, and not only where the system was going, but also the current capacities and gaps that are in the system right now. And I maintain that that's still a very important dialogue to have. And the question really is how to have it and with who. Now, math is a survivor. Ian Clark and Harry Swain, who many of you know, a few years ago, put math along with a lot of other acronyms in Ottawa as among the surreal things that Treasury boards do to departments and agencies. But math is still here, and it's evolved, and it's changed. It's a survivor. And we'll see if it's going to get better, because I think that's very much up for grabs at this point, to think about how this reporting system will occur. What I would like to suggest is that it is very unique by international standards. There's no other country that does something like math, and it's often held out as a good example of as part of a performance management and a reporting system. Today, I want to talk more about the open government side and focus in on capability and learning. I think there's some latent functions in math that are often not recognized, because most of the dialogue around math revolves around the costs of reporting in the system, whether or not it's relevant and has an impact on the system, and its management, its function as a risk management vehicle. And those things have been talked about a lot. But I think one of the reasons why math survives, and I think as an outsider is important, is because of these other things. Now, today I'm not going to give you an overview of the history of math. I really don't want to do that, but I just wanted to remind you that it did arise out of the developments in the late 1990s as a modern controllership initiative, and a whole lot of thinking about a whole of government view and a whole of organization view and how well they were performing. And so I think sometimes as we focus in on indicators that are associated with policy suites of Treasury Board and other central agencies, we kind of forget that larger purpose. It has become much more of a quality assurance system than I think was originally envisioned. I personally call it a systems check, which if we're in airplanes, we all think systems checks are very important in order to get to where we're going. So we should not lose sight of that. And I think it does feed into the COSO reviews, but we also have to recognize that when deputies are involved, they've always been reviewed according to many other considerations, and MAP was just one of them. Early on, of course, MAP was looking at the capabilities of departments and agencies, and the integrity of organizations and programs moved much larger. And I think that's somewhat less of an issue, although things like IT platforms remain really, really important. So for those of you who were not there then, that was the old math framework, and now this is the modern math framework. It looks a little different. It looks a little streamlined, but it's kind of hard to see that anything's really dropped off this. The criticisms of math are well known, and I've already mentioned Clark and Swain's critique of it sort of being a surreal exercise. And their idea was that a good deputy minister, she should cordon off her department from these kinds of demands from central agencies. There are non-trivial costs to a system such as this. The more it became a quality assurance and reporting exercise, the tick box phenomena emerged, so there was a view that you could game the system and learn how to perform better with it over time. The indicators shifted over time, in part because of learning through experience, but also because of different demands in the system. I think there's an interesting question about whether or not, for the purposes of performance review of deputy ministers, whether or not MAF results really get at how well deputy ministers are performing under pressure and responding to the issues of the day, and things that neither the government nor departments and agencies had anticipated. So MAF has to be understood as functioning in that environment. It relies very heavily on indicators, but there's no independent audit. There's really no effort to go into departments and agencies to see whether or not what these actual issues are that may lead to better performance in certain areas or below average performance. And this has been an abiding issue for the last couple reviews, which is that deputy ministers don't feel MAF reports are strategic enough. I think it's a really good point that they do understand, they should know, and if they don't, then MAF is fulfilling the purpose, what the state of their departments are. And it's a bit of a roll-up about that. But they naturally want to have a discussion about how this feeds into where they need to take your departments and agencies. I'd like to argue that MAF has a number of latent functions that too often we don't recognize. It's actually a database for Treasury Board analysts. It's a big database, and all the evaluations and audits and previous MAF reports and other lines of evidence are there to be accessed. And so the MAF portal and that process is compiling a whole lot of information that accretes over time. This is important in a central agency where, as many of you know, it's a high turnover operation. So the functions that it performs are important. But even when I used to be the Treasury Board Secretary many years ago, before some of you were born, I think, even then, analysts were rolling over very quickly. So they had to become instant smart. MAF reporting is a way that analysts can learn more about departments. The other thing is that MAF is, and this has been an abiding problem for years, MAF is a way for different parts of the Treasury Board Secretary and other central agency functions that are part of the MAF regime to actually talk to one another and develop a more holistic view of each department and agency. So however imperfect that reporting instrument is, it does have that function, and it's important from a Treasury Board Secretary and actually for the Secretary in discussions with heads of departments and agencies. Even back in the time of Ian Clark, there was something called the Shared Management Agenda, which is to identify 2 or 3 top organizational priorities, not policy priorities, for each department agency that everyone knew had to be worked on over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. And MAF undoubtedly flows into that kind of discussion. I was quite struck with the logic model that emerged from the evaluation and the response from the Treasury Board Secretary in this evaluation, because a huge amount of the recommendations, most of the recommendations, focus on more internal stakeholder engagement to reduce some of the irritants, improve the credibility of some of the indicators, and presumably get some of the context. Where that will go, I don't know, because I can see a lot of process emerging from it, and in the end, no one has a whole lot of time. So how can that process, I would submit, become as efficient and effective as possible? So I've got 4 questions for you from an open government perspective, because the previous slide sort of outlined notions that MAF functions from the standpoint of developing better understandings of capacity and performance within departments when it comes to administrative concerns. And it also fosters learning, and it can do that. But as I began to think about the last evaluation, like many of you, I was thinking about this open government context, and where did MAF fit into the scheme of things? So if MAF sits and brings together all kinds of information, why isn't it made more public to various stakeholders? The interesting thing there is that almost all the information that MAF relies upon is FOIable. The data is going to be produced anyhow. It's not like MAF makes the system collect that data. It's just moved into a different conveyor belt for reporting purposes. And other countries are doing things like creating portals that show all the machinery of government changes going back 80 or 100 years. And in some cases, they're putting reports like MAF and other evaluations and audit reports on the overall portal for that purpose. I don't think the idea is that there will be a flood of use of all these reports, but it's there for people who choose to use it. So that leads to the next idea of why not create a more open MAF portal that doesn't have to do with the transactions this year leading up to the evaluations, the assessments and evaluations, but becomes a bit of a resource and public library for people who want to know about your departments and agencies. The idea here is that surely we would rather have more informed discussions rather than less informed discussions. But you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. And for the public servants I've known over the years, they stand by their reports and they don't mind if they get into the public domain. The sensitivity about releasing them typically is from the political level. The information's there. To me, this would be an instance of low-hanging fruit. It is quite something. If you want to try and look at a variety of math reports, it is hard to get them. If you're taking a user-centered view of the math reporting process, you would think that the Treasury Board Secretariat would have a landing page, and you could go to every department and see all of the reports that matter. And so that would be a very a small thing that could be done, but would make it a much more of a difference and make people much more interested in the material. And that's premised on the idea that people should know, in order to have strategic conversations about the future, they should know about the health and the quality of the systems in departments and agencies now. That's the ultimate strategic discussion. So one thing that deputies want, of course, came up in the evaluation, is to better engage internal stakeholders. And it's an open question of the extent to which deputy ministers use math as an opportunity to have an organizational dialogue. Does it go beyond the executive team? Does it go to the senior management group? Or are there town halls of some kind where these reports might be discussed, and would they be useful for that purpose? The question I have is whether or not there should be more of that with outside stakeholders that probably have a vested interest in a more networked age in what the organization does and the quality of the work that's being done. In order to do that, it requires having a good narrative, because we know that performance information does not stand on its own. It does not tell its own story. So, this thing that deputies say, what deputies say about the need to have context and a narrative is very important, not only to temper the math results, but actually to engage them for future discussions with your people, but also with outside stakeholders. Now, I realize that this is a bit of a pipe dream, because you're saying, oh my gosh, we don't even have math right for internal purposes. So why would, someone come along and say, let's open it up a bit? And so I do realize that in performance systems, the moment you take internal reporting of this kind and reflection, it becomes something different when it goes out. But I think that the kind of information that goes out can be circumscribed a bit. There could be roll-ups. Deputy ministers could talk to different communities of stakeholders with this kind of report in mind, connected to strategic and business plans, which reflect the priorities of the government. Another thing is, does anyone care? Are we just talking about 4 academics and 3 interest groups that might be interested in these reports? I've thought about this for a long time, since I used to be in the Treasury Board Secretariat with Art and many colleagues, is that it really doesn't matter how many people use these reports. You've got to act in a democratic society as if they will be used, because that's what makes the public service and the government a democratic institution. So that work has to be done so that if it's called upon, there can be credible responses, both on the strategic policy side, but also on the organizational capacity side. Some of you may say, hey, we already kind of do this. We engage our executive team and senior management group with some external stakeholders in our department audit committees, but that's not engaging the outside world. It's inside baseball, and it remains inside baseball. So I think that there are, I'm making the case here for a more open process. It's not just about math per se. It would have to be connected to some of the other performance information that governments produce. At this point, I'm going to end my presentation. I'm going to thank you for your attention after a long conference, and I know we're all looking forward to your questions and commentary in just a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evert. So this is the portion of the day, and thank you so much to all of you for abiding by the time that we talked about. In fact, you're ahead of time, which is fantastic. One thing, Evert, I would love for you to do is to think about what would you pose as a question, be it resolve that, and maybe we'll get people to vote about it after we have the dialogue in terms of, in terms of this sharing of the maps, what would be the question that you would have us perhaps vote on by show of hands at the end of the session?
Right now.
Yeah, well, we won't ask them to vote now because I want to hear the questions and the back and forth. But you would like to see maps shared in an open environment with more open. So what would be your proposition? Can I ask you to clarify just a tad?
I think the question that I would put on the table is something along the lines of, be it resolved that MAP should be evolved to function in a more open government environment.
Do you have a year in mind? Do you have a time, or just indefinite? Sort of like by next year, by 3 years from now?
By the next election. What about that?
By next election, okay.
It can be part of the transition package
Perfect.
to the next government.
Perfect. So we're going to ask you to vote about that later, but for now, you know, you've got the results of the evaluation team that presented the results of the evaluation of the MAF. You've got a learned professor who's thought about this extensively and has got the background to be able to think about making this kind of public. Do we have some questions? Yes. Sorry.
I asked the results and delivery guy yesterday about risk, so I'm going to ask you about risk. It seems to have disappeared off MAP's radar completely. And in a results and delivery world, when you're doing an evaluation of MAP, don't you think risks and any risks that we're having towards program implementation, shouldn't that maybe first, rather than not at all? Oh.
What about risk?
Yeah, don't you think MAP should be addressing risk as an area of management in a results and delivery world? Because it seems to have disappeared right off MAP's radar. So did you make any recommendations as the subjects that should be put on? Because if you do, risk, please.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, you're right, risk did drop off of the risk management planning results and evaluation, AOM. In the evaluation, we did present finding to re-include risk in that AOM. We did get some feedback on that. As well, we got some feedback on some of the content of other AOMs as well that are non-core. So, for example, there was some feedback that we received that security AOM, for example, be applied to both large and small departments as well. So there is some findings in the evaluation report related to the content of the AOM.
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's important to understand that MAP is not designed to review programs. It's designed to review how the organizations function as an organization from a variety of different perspectives. And so that's what makes it different from most of the performance systems that we see internationally, and also the framework that we have, the results framework that we have driving the system that the government's doing now. So you're right. It's not about program risks. It's about whether or not, for example, your systems are supporting programs well. It's about whether, and you know, the list of categories that are there. So it's organizational, which is really, that's what makes it really distinctive internationally, is because most performance systems are either policy or program-based. And so I think you know, the interesting implication of your question is, should these things be linked more explicitly? You know, but if you're to put that on MAP, it would become way too heavy. And one way to look at the audit and evaluation regime is that it is program-based. And as some of you, my colleague here from Carleton, my gosh, I've been having a brain, Rob Shepard, knows that in the entire evaluation function is being challenged right now because it has to work quicker to be more relevant in this kind of fast cycle environment. So there are also challenges for these other reporting systems that are part of the larger performance picture, and so it's not just a math issue.
I'm going to go to the lady behind you, and then Walt, is that okay?
I just had a question.
Could I see the math logic model on the thing, and I'll come back with another question?
Perfect. So,
Hi, I was just wondering, couldn't we replace the math with our PIPs and have a PIP for internal services, and we would have performance indicators for HR, contracting, security, IT, et cetera, and then we could use the info base to mine that data across departments and compare across? Sorry.
I'm sorry, it's not very clear. Could you please just repeat that?
Couldn't we actually replace the math with PIPs? So have a PIP for internal service, like a program inventory for internal services, and have an individual PIP for HR, contracting, security, IT, et cetera, and have performance indicators, which then would be loaded into InfoBase, which then everybody could mine. Thanks.
I imagine you could do that. It would probably be a parallel exercise. Yes, and frankly, I haven't thought about it. As one of the evaluators, I can't really comment on the substantive area since, you know, we're considered to be a neutral function, so I can't really comment on, you know, sort of the value of your suggestion versus, you know, having math. So I guess certainly that would be food for further thought.
My quick answer to that would be why not? I still would be happy to argue, though, for a math type process because you have to do a roll up by department and agency. And I think that there's value in that and looking at how the entity is working as a whole, which again is not the same thing as a process. Yeah. So you know, that's one of the discussions that I think is supposed to come through the engagement process, right? And it sounds like a very good idea. And I think everyone in the system is looking for more efficient ways to do things, right? You still have the problem of whether or not the indicators are really getting at the performance and so on, but.
Yeah, and I think certainly, you know, if Ben were here, it would be something that he takes back to the department, to TDS, you know, for further discussion. And certainly, I guess, just by the reaction in the audience, it looks like people would be interested in that idea anyway. So, you know, I guess that's what I would suggest is keep raising that if it seems to have some traction.
When we were conducting the evaluation, the policy on results was just coming into force, and even at that time, with respect to the relevance, there was concerns then that about the relevance of math in relation to all of the other oversight kinds of measures, internal services measures that were being developed, and so on.
Chantal, looks like you might have a follow-up. Is it okay if we go to Chantal and then you?
Sorry.
Perfect.
Thank you, Steve. My name is Chantal. I work with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and I just wanted to maybe share my experience with math because we're not subject to math, but we've subjected ourselves to math since 2006 as a choice because for us, we want to give assurance to our Commissioner that we are complying with Treasury Board policies. So it's a way for us to do that, but also to look at our management practices and how we can improve them. So we self-assess ourselves every 2 years. We use the results to inform our strategic and operational planning. We report publicly in our annual, what it's called now, DRR, on the result, and we've always used it as an indicator to measure this, the health of our internal services program. So we've done this through the years, and we've adjusted to your changes to your methodologies. You've went to a 3-year cycle, so it kind of changed things for us a bit because we were doing it every 2 years, so we weren't kind of aligned. But over the years, I think what's worked for us was the flexibility that we had to use. So we used sometimes a combination of the methodology for smalls and the methodology for large, depending on what management wanted to know, what was useful for them. And by the way, more and more we find that the methodology for small isn't very useful for our purposes internally to improve management practices. So just to feedback on that. But I think what's worked for us is the flexibility that we have in applying this. And going forward, we're thinking of aligning it to the gentleman's question around risk is we're going to be using our corporate risk profile to inform where we want to focus our math assessment on. So again, managing the level of effort that's required and making it useful and relevant to us. But that's because we have the flexibility. And I think that's where the success comes from for us, and also because it's not tied to our commissioner's performance appraisal. It's, you know, we have that like Steve said, the safe space to talk about what's working well, what's not working well, and making improvements along the way. So that, I think for us, and it would have probably been an interesting case study for your evaluation, that we've used the tool, I think, to what it's really meant to be used for, and it's been a success story for our organization. So when it's worked.
Wow, it's really too bad Ben's not here. Better take some good notes. So we're being recorded, so we'll get him to review that after. That's great. Anybody want to speak to that from the panel?
Well, it does raise an interesting scale question, which is, does math work better for small organizations where you can have that kind of dialogue, right? And the larger the organization with more program areas, then perhaps this really becomes attenuated. And there may be a different way to do it better. You could have a whole session just to explore what that might look like. But there's no doubt with large-scale organizations, it becomes a different thing. Thank you.
Well, and I would also comment that a lot of departments, agencies feel that math is being done to them. They didn't put up their hand to volunteer, so they're just sort of doing what they have to do to get through it, and they're not really looking at the results the way you guys are. Like, you're actually looking at the results, you're building your plans, you're resourcing them accordingly. That's not the general story. Most departments and agencies feel that it's a burden that's been put upon them and they have no choice.
Yeah.
I think it also speaks to the issue of usefulness and how math can be made more useful to specific audiences, because there were mixed results around that. And so I think you're raising that issue to a bit of a higher profile. And, I guess given the amount of engagement that's undertaken for math, I think those are some of the things that can also be raised with the Math Directorate, in terms of increasing the relevance of math for all of the audiences.
Walt?
Thank you for your comments and for putting up the logic model. I just wanted to go back and get an understanding of what the intent was for this logic model for the math, and I'm not quite clear what the intent is from that logic model, frankly. I haven't been involved with math for a few years, but my impression is that math is a Treasury Board program, right? It is a Treasury Board program. No, it's not? It's not a program?
It's led by Treasury Board, it's not a program.
Well, it has some in expected results out of it and that kind of stuff. So it is an initiative that is a change initiative of some sort or other. I call that a program. Okay? And for me, it looked like, given the evaluation methodology that you used, no data was being collected on this program. You used the usual kinds of things you do without any kind of a database that was collected by the Treasury Board Secretariat to measure the performance of this program. Would that be true?
We can't really speak to the data that's been collected. We use the data that was available, and I think that would probably be more a question for Ben if he were here as the Director of Math Directorate. In terms of the information and data that was available, methodology included things like the information from the math portal, and that kind of thing. But if you're asking what information or what data is being collected, if that's your question.
Well, it looks like it was limited given the methodology that you used. No data was being collected by the Treasury Board Secretariat on this program, if you believe that it was a program.
Okay, well, we use the data and information that was available. Of course, Math Portal is some of the information that was available.
No.
But if you're challenging Treasury Board on the collection of data for MAFD, you'd have to speak to...
They require the rest of us to do that.
Yep.
So why wouldn't the goose and the gander, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, from that point of view?
Yep.
So I think it's a great question. So let me ask you what you would consider to be the performance indicators that you would look for, because you're searching for. I'm not.
Well, I'm going on a chain of results that says that maybe math, if you instrumented math properly, would be a measure of Treasury Board Secretariat's performance on influencing departments in good management practice, is what I would say.
Well, so no one here is speaking for the math math directorate, right, right now. As a person who's thought about research utilization over the years, both use of policy analyses, academic research, there's a huge literature on the use of reports like many of you produce, whether they're department reports or evaluations or audits. And one has to be very careful about measuring performance in that regard, because often they're not used directly, they're used indirectly, and they're used over time in very serendipitous ways. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask the question, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't look for data on it. As an outsider to the design of the process, I would say that it was a utilization-focused evaluation that relied very heavily on qualitative information. So the findings do reflect that. But the reason why I asked you the question back, I think it's really interesting right now. We, if you look at the FOI file, we wonder how quickly departments get returned to respond to FOI requests, right? And you could see a whole host of indicators that you could use when it comes to the math function. I don't think that math is just the property of the Treasury Board Secretariat. It has certain functions with it, and it's one way that they can look at the compliance with the so-called policy suite. But, the other client here is the clerk of the Privy Council and COSO, and it's one indicator. So imagine trying to do an attribution analysis of math reports, given all the things that deputies are expected to do in a totally overdetermined. So I think it's a good question, and if it goes with the earlier comment about using PIP information, we have to be clear about the multifaceted stakeholders that are using this, and not just focus on one part of trying to measure the system and improve it, because it's way more complicated than that.
I think the other thing that I would say as well is, if I understand your question correctly, is are we able to measure the extent to which TDS is able to influence the performance of other departments? And that's a perennial issue for Treasury Board, obviously, because most of what TDS does has to do with supporting and engaging other departments, and bearing in mind that deputy heads are really in charge of their own departments. Treasury Board can't dictate, how resource allocation occurs, in terms of deputy heads managing their own departments. So, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Well, yes, at the same time, with the kind of system we have in place in terms of deputy head accountability, Treasury Board really operates in terms of facilitating, engaging, and enabling the other departments.
Not a program, program, but it actually is an initiative that contributes to the Secretary's oversight of
Yeah, and just to speak to the defense of Becky's group, particularly having seen Ellen Petrus present on the fact that the Treasury Board Secretariat sections are required to do logic models for their areas now, thanks to you guys. So they are thinking about results and looking at that. Whether it's fully clear in this case or not is for the everyone to decide. But we know that they are on that track as well.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think the logic model for the math is being rethought. There are probably going to be some revisions to how it's articulated as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Tom?
Thanks very much. I want to thank all of you for, bringing out some of the underlying questions about the math. In one of Everett's remarks really struck home to me, where he said, well, look, this isn't subject to audit. So as a participant in external audit of functions that were subject to math, I have two areas that I'd like to raise to you. First of all, what I found when I did audit work, which involved program evaluation, I found that the Treasury Board analysts who we tried to get information from wouldn't give it. And they said, well, it's the confidence of the Queen's Privy Council. I can't give you that information. So that's certainly an obstacle to external audit. The second thing was that we raised this inside the Office of the Auditor General as a question. Well, what do we do about math? And the reason why we raised it as a question was because when we went to parliamentary committee, deputies would say, well, we've got a very good math rating on this, and the Auditor General's all wet. It doesn't make sense, you know, that our math rating's excellent. How can the Auditor General have this conclusion? So that was brought up, and I said, as I recall, and no one can verify this, so I can say it, I said, why don't we do an audit, a government-wide audit of the math? And I got a really interesting answer. And again, no attribution to who gave me the answer, but I'll just say it was from the top. And she said, well, we're not going to do that. She said, we have our own sources of evidence. We stand behind what we report. We know why we report what we report, and we can provide the evidence for it. And so we're not really concerned if someone else has a different conclusion or observation, because we have the evidence that we have. But it remains to be a problem, I think, when a deputy minister can say, I've got a good math rating, and then try to confuse parliamentarians, which, by the way, is not difficult in this area. But I'm raising these 2 points. I wondered if anyone would want to comment on them, and particularly Evert, because he's really put a cat amongst the pigeons with respect to some of his comments.
We've got about 3 minutes until we're supposed to be finished, but please go ahead. We'll go a few more minutes, is okay? As expected, we're getting a lot of interest from the floor, okay?
Well, I was going to ask you to cut off the questioners just before the last question.
You saw them coming up.
Well, I think one thing, to go back, there is some common cause between the Auditor General's office and the precursors to math. And this is ancient history for many of you in the room, but it sprung out of the notion of well-performing organizations.
Yes.
And so all those areas in math are about that. There's big literature at the time, and so this is a legacy of those, the thinking really of the 1990s and early noughts. So I think that's probably a smart response from your superior, whoever she was, and because in some ways you're a program review operation for the most part. You review programs, sometimes organizations, and you do look at capacity, right? So you're both interested in capacity. So there's a bit of the institutional politics among different agencies and external entities, and I can see why that balance would have been struck or that decision made. When I talked about audit, though, I wasn't really thinking of external audit. I was actually thinking about the ability of the Secretariat or other policy secretariats in other parts of the center to be able to go in and see what was actually going on. So if anything, with sort of an internal, external system audit to go in, how would that actually work? It's an ill-formed idea, but I think it would get at whether or not indicators were really telling you what the situation was, and for better or for worse. And so that was the spirit of that comment. But thank you, it's a very good question.
Anybody else want a piece of that, or? Okay for now? Okay. So I've got 2 more, I've got one off the floor. Oh, okay, and we got 3 more maybe? Well, let's keep them quick. So John?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I'd like to congratulate you and the PPX organizers for what a great way to end the 2-day session. I promise to behave. So I was inspired by Everett's dialogue, and also the lady from the Office of Privacy Commissioner. And wouldn't it be interesting, it's sort of a be it resolved, is if Treasury Board Secretariat said to departments and agencies, we want to cut you some slack, and we're not going to require you to report on math in the traditional way. What we'd like you to do within these parameters is report on the state of management practices within your organization publicly, just in the same way we do with the departmental results reports. And that could be done within the current departmental results reports if you wanted to, or as a separate document. And I think that would be quite interesting because what I've observed since the beginning of MAF, the introduction of MAF, is that it has moved increasingly towards internal services performance measurement document and a lot of the sound management practices, which was the original intent of Ralph Heinzman and others when they developed that. So I'd just like to leave that with you as a possibility. I think that would be quite powerful.
And just building on that, John, Mike Haley from the floor said many departments flag some MAF indicators in their PIPs. So this links to the lady's point. To the panel's knowledge, do any departments use these as an internal services dashboard? So this idea of using some of this in a different way. Thoughts?
I don't know the answer to that. I can't help you.
Haven't seen it.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
And we'll have a table for the MAF directorate to consider.
Perfect. Okay, so one more from Walt.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for your insights on the program. I'm still not convinced, but that's okay. I wanted to address Dr. Lindquist's proposal. And my concern is, if we made this public, I've seen what making evaluation reports public, and I've seen what making DERs or DPRs public over the last few years. They've become such polished and refined documents that, frankly, you have no sense of whether there is an issue or not that's coming out of them because of the fact that they're public and the fact that they're going to be used as a bludgeon by the opposition in Parliament. So that's been a classic problem, and I wonder whether I would rather see MAF underground and deliver the real goods, not only about how departments are operating, but also how the Treasury Board is facilitating that performance, than bring it out in the open and have it happy-faced.
So there's the case against, folks. We're coming to a vote soon. Case for?
Well, that on the slide after my open government perspective view on MAF, that was the first point that was raised. And so, and as I said in my remarks, there's a lot of experience and also literature to indicate in support of your point. But on the other hand, I think that the capacity of departments and agencies is an important part of the discussion. I think there are ways to have certain levels of information, and I agree with you, the tendencies to get thinner and more plastic words and that kind of thing, and we all know about that. But I don't think that most public servants, nor most executives, are afraid to talk about where their organizations are at. We don't have a habit of doing it. Other jurisdictions like Australia used to have really big, fulsome, thick annual reports. You could read those things, they'd be 100 pages long, and there weren't performance indicators or anything like that. You could learn from far what those organizations are about. And because of accrual reporting and budgeting and stuff like that, it's been bled out of the system. So we actually live in a world where we really don't know much about organizations. I cannot tell you how opaque your departments and agencies appear to even people like Rob and I, who are very interested in what you do and why you do it, and actually are quite supportive of the public service enterprise. Telephone books don't even work, and for a variety of reasons, and I know that sort of thing. So I actually come from the side, from a viewpoint that it's important for external stakeholders to know how their public organizations work. Whether it needs to surface all the nitty-gritty or rely on indicators that don't really tell you much about that, what's really going on and what the cross pressures are, is a different matter. But I think it's important, and it needs to be done in a smart way. And so I think your point is a worthy one.
So I won't put our evaluators on the spot to answer the question and respect your neutrality unless you'd like to add to the conversation in any way. Because I think it's about time to have a vote. So the be it resolved was, help me through this, Evert. The be it resolved was that the MAF reports should with the transition to whatever next government we get, be made public.
No.
Or be made.
I had a better motion earlier.
Yes, give me your words.
I think my motion was be it resolved that the MAF initiative explore opportunities to be adapted for the open government environment before the next transition.
I think I've seen a referendum on it, that's all I want. Okay. So how many are for the motion? How many nays? Well, I don't know. It looks like maybe the motion carries. I'm not sure. Well done. In any case, thank you so much for your time and attention. Please thank our panel for really doing a great job. This is an assembled panel. Thank you very, very much. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our symposium chair, Katie Brown. Sure.